talk exclusively this week about Gwen John in roughly chronological sequence. And normally I refer to artists by their surname, but to avoid confusion, I'll talk about them as Gwen and Augustus. So let's look at their two portraits together, and you'll, I think, see what I mean about people projecting their personalities from their portraits. And it's been assumed, a lot of people assume, that Gwen was quiet, intense, reserved, introverted, and Augustus was this social, wild extrovert. And there's some truth in that, but as we'll see, it's not quite that simple. Their mother, Augusta, was often ill as they grew up, and she died when Gwen was 8 and Augustus was 6. And it was then, in fact, that they moved to Tenby. Their father, Edwin, was a solicitor and was cold and distant, although not completely uncaring. For example, he used to write to Gwen when she lived in France frequently, like once a week. But when he died, Gwen never went to his funeral, which I think says something about their relationship. But I think a quote that Augustus wrote about his sister is important to read, because I think it gives us an insight into her work. He wrote, "Gwen and I were not opposites, but much the same really, but we took a different attitude. I am rarely exuberant. She was always so, latterly in a tragic way. She wasn't chaste or subdued, but amorous and proud. She didn't steal through life, but preserved a haughty independence, which some people mistook for humility. Her passions for both men and women were outrageous and irrational. She was never unnoticed by those who had access to her." So I think that says a lot about what he considered she was like, and he would know better than most. And it's worth considering his words. She was, he said, exuberant, that is full of energy, excitement, cheerfulness, but she was proud and haughty, but also outrageously passionate. And we know that Augustus would visit exhibitions of her work and peer obsessively at her pictures. And when the critics criticized her or took no notice of her, he wrote, "To me, the little pictures are almost painfully charged with feeling, even as their neighbors are empty of it. Gwen's pictures are simply staggering." Now, he quickly became a leading figure in the art world, and she was largely ignored. There was some interest in her work about 1926 when she gave her first solo exhibition, but in her lifetime she was known, but a minor artist, and he was a leading social painter. But he once said, "50 years after my death, I shall be remembered as Gwen John's brother." That is only as her brother. And that would, because he died in 1961, that would have been in 2011. And he was spot on that about that time, she became regarded as one of the most important British artists of the 20th century. And he'd been largely forgotten, to the extent that in 2004, when Tate had a retrospective of Gwen John's work, it tried to show some of his work to reclaim his reputation. And in fact, in the last few years, his reputation has been on the rise again. Now, a simplistic description of them that you'll often come across is that Gwen was a recluse, had an affair with Rodin, painted quiet interiors with solitary women, and he was a wild bohemian society portrait painter who is rumoured to have fathered 100 children, and he had numerous affairs. Now, it's correct as far as it goes, but the reality, as we're beginning to see, was a lot more complex than that. Let me show you her first picture, which she painted in 1896, when we know she returned briefly from the Slade, where she was at art school, to her home in Tenby. And this is a painting of Tenby, the older woman in the picture. The woman, or there's two, well, let me point to them. This woman is what I meant here, is her younger sister Winifred. We don't know who the girl is. I've got a photograph that shows you the same view across the beach to the harbour at Tenby, and it's interesting. Well, I think it's interesting that you can see how she's manipulated the scene. She's added this strong chiaroscuro, as we call it, this contrasting light and dark, to create a sense of drama. And she's cleverly arranged the shadows so that the two figures are against the bright light behind them, so stand out. And the painting sort of revolves around the upturned face of the young girl looking up to her sister. It is dramatic, but I suppose in a contradictory way, it's also, to me, it gives a strong sense of timelessness and peace, like many of her later paintings, although this isn't typical, of course, of her later paintings. But it's interesting to see how she started. And as I said, she painted this when she was still at art college. Now, she trained at the Slade between 1895 and 1898. And when she went there, her younger brother, Augustus, had already started there. I think it took a bit longer for Gwen to convince her father, the solicitor, that she'd be safe in London. And by the way, the Slade at the time was the only art college that took women students. She lived with her brother, well, maybe it reassured her father. They lived together at 21 Fitzroy Street, which is near the BT Tower. And at the time, it was notorious for its brothels, and the house they lived in was in fact an ex-brothel. I'm sure her father didn't know about this. The landlady was, her son was a student at the Slade, and she was also an extremely eccentric, mature student at the Slade. But this isn't her landlady. This is a painting of her cleaner, Mrs. Atkinson. There's a sheep's skull you can see on the mantelpiece. I don't think that has any symbolic significance. I assume they just had a sheep's skull on the mantelpiece. She's glancing anxiously sideways. I mean, Simon Schaumer interprets this as her being uncertain of what's wanted of her as a model, because of course she's her cleaning lady. They didn't have much money, Gwen and her brother. They survived on fruit and nuts, and occasionally were invited out to dinner by their friends who had more money. And even then, well, her brother was much better known. He was seen to be one of the leading, most capable draftsmen in the country, even as a student. And that made him a celebrity at the college. He was a known artist. Everybody looked to him as he was the best technical drawer. She made friends. She made a lot of friends. There was a little group of her friends called, there was Ida Nettleship, Ursula Tyrwhitt, Edna Waugh, Gwen Salmond, and the group of them were known as the nursery because they acted in a childlike manner. For example, they gave each other names from the Jungle Book. And it was Ida Nettleship, one of Gwen's friends, who became the first wife of her brother. But what I wanted to say about this painting is a technical point. It's a tonal painting, which means she used a limited palette. As you can see, it's mostly rich earth colors, browns, and varied their tonal value. And it's important to understand this to understand her later paintings. And it also applies to Whistler's paintings as well. She varied the tone. Let's give you some terminology. First of all, the color. I mentioned the rich earth colors, more accurately known as hues. Secondly, there's the tone, which is what we mean by how light or dark it is. So if you take a particular hue, that is a particular color, and add white, it's called a tint. And if you add black, it's called a shade. So by creating tints and shades of a particular hue, in this case, a sort of browny color, you can create a complete painting of almost in a single color, but very strong tonal differences, lights and darks. And then there's another technical word, which is, people use different words to describe it. It's called the chroma, or sometimes the saturation or intensity of a hue. Another word that's used is the purity of the hue. And one way of understanding it is that I said if you add white, you get a tint, and black, you get a shade. Supposing you add a gray that's exactly the same tone as the hue, then what happens is the tone stays the same, but you're, if you like, diluting the color, the hue, it's becoming less pure, and that's changing the chroma, making it, if you like, a sort of a weaker, but the same tone, but a weaker form of that hue. And so you can see that an artist can manipulate, they could use saturated colors and paint something using a wide range of colors, or they could use the same or a very restricted palette of colors and change the tone, as she's done here, and as she does in her later paintings, by adding black and white to change the tone. So enough of that technical background, but I thought it was important to understand her paintings. But there's other aspects to her paintings as well. This is an early painting. She also painted in her last year at the Slade. And an important point to make here actually is that she didn't paint many paintings compared with other artists, roughly about 200 in her lifetime, oil paintings. But she did produce several thousand, I think about 2,500 drawings. And she planned very carefully. So she would do a lot of sketches of what she wanted to paint. And I might briefly mention later that she, on her sketches, she used a very complicated numbering system to remind herself of the colors to use. And the numbering system she used hasn't been fully decoded. We don't quite understand. The system is so complicated, we don't really understand it. But after that planning, she'd then paint rapidly, as Whistler did. And if she wasn't happy with the result, she'd start again and do it again. Her pictures are nearly all what you might call modest or unassuming, and have what many people have called a quiet presence. The palette, as I said, that is the range of hues, is restricted, and they're nearly all fairly small in size, like this one's about 46 by 33. The subject matter, she did paint landscapes and interiors, but a lot of her work is a single woman or a small group, as here, and there's no obvious story or message or symbolism. It's a sort of timeless, quiet moment. Most of her drawings, by the way, are in the National Museum of Wales, and her letters and papers are preserved there as well. Right, if you do want to read personality into a portrait, and I've been warning about the dangers, this maybe shows what Augustus referred to as a haughty side. But about this time, this is 1900, she went to Paris in 1898, and she attended, I've been referring to Whistler, she actually attended James McNeill Whistler's Académie Carmen in Paris, and she was influenced by his tonal approach. And she settled in Paris a bit later in 1904, a few years later, after finishing at the Academy. To make money, she worked as a model, and she became Rodin's model and then mistress. And she was part of the artistic world of Paris. She knew all the main artists there. He was one of the loves of her life, Rodin, and he stopped seeing her in about 1913, about 9 years after she became his mistress, and he died in 1917. And she always, even after he died, referred to herself as Rodin's little wife. And she stayed in France, lived in France for the rest of her life, but exhibited in England and in France, although she didn't exhibit very often. As I said, she had to make money because she didn't sell many paintings. She had to make money as a model. She posed nude for Auguste Rodin and for other artists, mostly women. And in her diaries, she wrote that she was often working as a model, harassed or abused by both men and women artists. And she gives an example that one of her clients, a woman artist, spent the whole session kissing a man all afternoon, and then told her not to tell anyone if she wanted to keep her job as a model. So she was treated as a child, discussed as if she wasn't there, kept waiting for hours, shouted at, ignored, given no breaks, propositioned by male artists, of course. So she had to cope with all of that, but she needed to work as a model simply to make money. Now, about this time, and I'm showing this, I think this is the last painting by Augustus John that I'll be showing you, but I'm showing it to you to explain a complex relationship. Both of these paintings, one by Gwen, one by Augustus, are of the same person. Dorelia, well, her real name was Dorothy McNeill, and Gwen met her in 1903, just before she settled in Paris. And Gwen introduced her to Augustus, who chose to name her Dorelia. And the painting, slightly later painting, 1908, on the right is by Augustus, showing her dressed as a gypsy. That's what this this dress implies, and it was designed, in fact, by Dorelia. And throughout his life, we'll hear later that Augustus was interested in the Romany people, which he always referred to as gypsies. Now, shortly after they had met, Gwen and Dorelia, the word that's often used is eloped. They eloped together, intending to hike to Rome. They slept rough. They didn't have tents. They slept in barns. They had little to eat. They scrounged food. They sketched people for money. They sang for money. And they walked 150 miles until they reached Toulouse, where they decided to end their journey in Toulouse. And in Toulouse, they rented a cheap room where this painting on the left was painted, and there's 3 others that were painted. I'll show you one more. On the journey, Gwen, I think this tells you a bit about what she was like. She insisted that Dorelia carried all of her equipment, you know, easels and palettes and colors and so on, so that her artist's hands would not be damaged. She's shown here, she's shown Dorelia wearing a simple dress, which we'll see later. I think it must be a dress that she often put on models to paint them. Her face looks thinner than she looked a few years later when painted by Augustus. That's probably because they'd just walked 150 miles with little food. There's some large books on the table. The top one is called La Russie, or Russia, and she's holding a third book. So it's a bit like a student, and that's what she chose to call it, rather than calling it a portrait of Dorelia. They're both sort of about particular people, but they're both generic titles: Woman Smiling and The Student. She's lit perhaps by a candle as a yellow light shining up from the table, and it's a sort of studious look, as if she's immersed in thought. We would expect her to sit down in a moment and start reading. And we don't have any idea from these paintings about the rank and status of the sitter. They're types of people, I suppose. Notice also that Dorelia was an excellent model, which they both said in that she could adapt her personality to whatever the artist required her to be. And another final point on these two, before I move on to just Gwen's work, is that a painting by Augustus suggests action. That is, you get the feeling that something is about to happen, whereas Gwen's paintings, it's as if it all happened a long time ago. It's quiet. Or if you like, it's a still moment in the present time. And we'll see more of that in a moment. This timelessness you also get in Vermeer, which critics at the time pointed out. Another painting from their the room they rented in Toulouse. They were exhausted and undernourished by the time they arrived in Toulouse. They stayed there 3 months. This is called Dorelia in a black dress. The third one was, she also painted Dorelia by lamplight, and they were painted, and this is another important point about her technique. She painted directly onto the canvas without underdrawing, which is unusual for an artist, but she did lots of sketches. She did lots of planning for the colors and tones to use, but then she would paint directly on the canvas, and she tended to paint from the outside inwards. She would start painting the background and just work in towards the figure, and then the final bit she painted was the face. Extremely difficult to do, because without any underdrawing, you don't know when to stop and when to start the different parts of the body, and she did it without corrections. She had a very good visual sense of space. They met, Gwen and Dorelia. I said they met. They actually met while Dorelia was at the Westminster School of Art, and as far as I can make out, I tried to find out what her background is, but there's little known about her. But it's said that she was a typist from Camberwell and worked or studied at the Westminster School of Art in the evening. This or one of this group of paintings sold at Sotheby's for about $500,000 a few years ago. The interesting point being that they estimated it would sell for about 150,000. So there was obviously a desire to acquire her work. In other words, she's become very collectible painter. Now, this is a good friend of Gwen's, Chloe Boughton Lee. We think it was painted in Gwen's attic room in Paris, which she used as a studio. And a technique she learnt at the Slade was to take opaque oil colors and dilute them so that they are softer and more translucent, thinner, a bit more like watercolors. By the way, in case you're wondering, at the bottom, yes, she did add a strip of wood to the bottom. This is a painting that's on display in the Tate. And she added the strip of wood, I think, so that she could show all of her hands and the piece of paper. Maybe this is what comes from workings from the sides inwards and the top downwards. She'd miscalculated slightly. Now, Chloe, although that wasn't her real name was Ellen, she had a sister, Maud Boughton Lee, who was at the Slade the same time as Gwen. That's how she met her sister Chloe, and they became good friends and stayed good friends. It looks as though she's lost in thought, maybe thinking about the note. It looks as though she might snap out of it any time. She's alone in an interior. It's fairly small painting. It's been suggested, although I wouldn't suggest this, that it's a reflection of Gwen's introverted character. Remember, her brother described her as outrageously passionate and haughty, not retiring, which I think probably is more accurate. And this painting was exhibited at the New English Art Club in 1908 and described by one critic as one of the greatest achievements in the exhibition because of its sincerity. And another critic wrote, intensity, this quality so uncommon in English painting, she retained all her life, and it was present in everything she did. That was a comment made later. Some people describe the female figure she paints as being imbued with sadness. You can see sadness in her face, perhaps, but I feel they're not sad or happy, but she's just caught a moment in time. Like Vermeer, who she was compared with Vermeer at the time. She's captured a moment in time. And it just reminds me of a point that the poet T.S. Eliot made about the still point of the turning world. And I'll just play you a short excerpt from one of his poems, Burnt Norton, read by Alec Guinness.
Flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement, and do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered.
And the reason I played that is because for me, that says a lot about what she captures in her paintings. They're not attempts to capture a character as such. They are tonal arrangements, as Whistler would call them, but they capture a moment in time. And I'm putting it alongside another portrait of Boughton Lee that she painted 3 years later. And she would, although she would do many, many sketches, and then she would complete a painting, a portrait in 1 or 2 sittings. So she actually painted quite quickly, but she wasted a lot of canvases in the sense that if she wasn't happy with the result, she would start again. So meticulous preparation and rapid creation, which is one of the hallmarks of Whistler's work as well. Maybe that's how he influenced her when she attended his Académie Carmen in Paris. And it was about this time, 1910, that she acquired her first and in fact only patron, John Quinn, an American lawyer and art collector, and he continued to support her until his death in 1924 and purchased nearly all of her work. And that freed her from having to work as a model. She no longer, from 1910, had to work as a model and could devote herself to painting. And she started to exhibit more frequently. She wrote in 1911, "I paint a good deal, but I don't often get a picture done. That requires for me a very long time of a quiet mind and never to think of exhibitions." So she didn't, you might have come across artists who say, well, they're rushing to finish some works to complete the number they want to exhibit. She wasn't like that. She put that to the back of her mind. She spent a long time thinking and planning. And in fact, it was in when she had her first solo exhibition, which wasn't until 1926 in London. It was at that exhibition she was described as a sort of modern day Vermeer. A later reviewer, in fact in the Observer, wrote, "The force of this almost obsessive reticence is astonishing. The extreme subtlety and reticence of the exquisite tonal arrangements is the chief source of delight. Its power within awesomely restricted means is reminiscent of Morandi." Now, if you don't know Morandi, I've got one of his works here from the Tate, so you can see what he means about restricted means and subtle tonal arrangements. Morandi was, Giorgio Morandi was an Italian artist who he did paint a few landscapes, but most of what he painted was these arrangements of a small number of vases and pots that he would continuously arrange on surfaces and paint with a restricted number of hues and variations in the tonal arrangements to create this subtlety and reticence, which he's been compared with Gwen John. Now, Gwen loved cats, and she acquired this tortoiseshell cat in 1904, which was when she went to Paris. She named the cat Edgar Quinet after the street she lived in. The cat had kittens occasionally, and she often drew, painted the cat, its kittens, and so on. And the cat disappeared 4 years later in 1908. She wrote then about the little mysterious soul in the body of a cat. So she did paint pictures other than portraits. She painted some still lives, as we see, some interiors and a few landscapes. And she wrote, "A cat or a man, it's the same thing. It's an affair of volumes. The object is of no importance," which I think is an important quote because it, as I was saying, it's for her, it's a tonal arrangement, or maybe for her it would be it's a tonal arrangement as it would be for Whistler, but it's also an affair of volumes. So the structure, the shape of the object is important to capture, as well as the tonal arrangement. But the actual character of the thing she's painting is of no importance to her, be it a cat or a man. It's the same thing, she wrote. These cat pictures, by the way, were done from life, which means she had to work very quickly. And as you can see, she's used a brush and applied broad color washes and a very rapid technique to capture a particular moment in time before the cat moves. And this is a self-portrait with letter from Rodin. As I said, she had to support herself modeling, and that's how she met Auguste Rodin. He was possibly the most famous artist in the world at the time, and she became deeply obsessed with him, as she did with people. She was the sort of person that could become deeply obsessed with another person, male or female. She was 28 at the time. She became his mistress and he was 64. She wrote him literally thousands, I think over 2,000 letters every day. And her friends and family became worried about her and the consequences. She was so deeply obsessed with him. Rodin continued, who had a number of lovers, distanced himself from her about 1912 onwards and ended the affair in 1914. And he, towards the end, he used his secretary and assistants to make excuses to avoid seeing her. When the affair ended, she became a Catholic. She had always, incidentally, been religiously inclined, but she became much more focused or obsessed, if you like, with Catholicism. And she spent the rest of her life alone in a Paris suburb, working as what she called God's little artist. Incidentally, you might have heard about another famous lover of Rodin, Camille Claudel. She was his lover earlier, although they continued to see each other. And it was the scandal, I think it is, about Claudel is that she was committed to an asylum in 1913 by a doctor and her brother. And within a short time, the doctors in the asylum said there was no need for her to be there. She should be released. But her family, particularly her mother, refused to sign the release. I guess that couldn't be done by the doctors alone. And she stayed in the asylum, a perfectly normal person, an artist, for 30 years. And the hospital staff regularly proposed she be released, but her mother adamantly refused. But back to Gwen John. This is Fenella Lovell, an acquaintance of Gwen. The pair of paintings, which aren't in the same gallery, the one on the right's in the Tate, and I think it's on display now in the new hang in Tate Britain, and the one on the left is in New York. It's been the pair have been compared with these Goyas the Maha Vestida and the Maha Desnuda, the clothed, the nude Maha. Lucian Freud said of her paintings that they reveal the volcano beneath the placid surface. And remember, her brother wrote that her passions for men and women were outrageous and irrational. But it's, and that sometimes is commented on about these paintings, but I don't think that's the case, because Gwen wrote in a letter to a friend, Ursula Tyrwhitt, who I mentioned earlier, in fact, who she stayed in touch with. She met at the Slade, if you remember, that Gwen wrote that she intensely disliked Fenella Lovell. And let me quote, "It's a great strain doing Fenella. It is a pretty little face, but she is dreadful. That's why," she wrote, "I want to send the 2 paintings to the New English Art Club, because I may sell them, and then I shall pay her what I owe and never see her again." Now, the paintings were exhibited there, but they didn't actually sell, so I'm not sure what happened between her and Fenella Lovell. And these paintings are often used as an example of a woman painting a female nude, or in this case semi-nude, and whether that's different from a man painting. Kenneth Clark, just to give you 2 views of that, Kenneth Clark, in his older book 1953, he wrote a book called The Nude, A Study in Ideal Form, and he defined naked as being deprived of clothes and implying embarrassment and shame, while a nude is a work of art with no such connotations. However, John Berger, who you might have heard of, in Ways of Seeing, 1972, so some 20 years later, wrote that the word naked means to be oneself, to be without disguise, which I think is closer to what we have here. It's she's painting a woman without disguise, if you like, a woman who just happens to have no clothes on, rather than what's been said about the male gaze and the male artist objectifying the nude, if it's a nude female figure. It was incidentally, it was praised, these paintings. Just another point, as we're talking about the nude, it was important, of course, for female artists to learn how to paint figures, and that was difficult to do if they're clothed. It's much easier to learn about the structure of the body from the nude figure, male and female, but it wasn't, women were restricted, and even in the Slade, and so they had to use other techniques, but to keep them secret. So a woman artist could, for example, draw her own body in a mirror, but that's very difficult to do. And Gwen complained to her brother about how difficult it was. Friends would draw each other, but would keep silent about that, because the respectability of middle-class women students would be jeopardized if they acknowledged that they'd worked from studies even of their own body or those of friends. So they had to imply that they were studies of anonymous working class models. So in other words, it was difficult for women artists to learn to paint the human figure. But Gwen found ways to do that. I said that she didn't always paint figures. This is an interior. In fact, it's her room in Paris. It was an attic room in an area of Paris near the Luxembourg Gardens. And she lived there from 1907 to 9. So she lived there for a couple of years. And she wrote that on hot summer nights, she would creep into the Luxembourg Gardens and sleep under the stars with her cat. She, in fact, spent all of her money on paint and treats for her cats, to the extent that she would starve herself or live on fruit and nuts, as she had done as a student with her brother. He by then, of course, was living the high life. She wasn't, don't get me wrong, though, although she kept herself to herself, remember, she was no recluse. People would know she was there. She had many friends and contacts in the Paris art world. She stayed in touch with her Slade friends, with her brother, with her family, her father. And we had many of her letters. She talks of friends in Paris, boat trips on the Seine, visiting galleries, sitting and drawing in pavement cafes and so on. So I don't want to imply she spent all of her time sitting lonely in this room. She was a sociable person. But again, if you look at this picture, there's a quietness about it. The outside world is intruding. The window is open. There's a blue sky, the sun shining. Her outdoor coat is resting on the wicker chair, ready for her to pick up and leave. This, of course, was painted when she was in the middle of her love affair with Rodin. His interest was declining, and it's been suggested that this empty chair signifies his absence and her sadness, but I'm not sure of that. I see it sort of more related to this pair of paintings that Van Gogh painted a few years before in 1888, when expecting Gauguin to visit his studio, which of course he did. And you can see that in the case of Van Gogh, he's managed to imbue the still life, the chairs, with personality. If you look at his chair, the one on the left, it's simple and functional and contains his pipe and tobacco, whereas Gauguin's chair is more elegant. It's got arms, it's a finely carved armchair, it's intellectual, it's got books on the chair, it's got it's evening, it's got lights to read the books by. And I suppose you could say that Gwen's chair, some people say Gwen's chair is more feminine and the other two more masculine, but I'm not myself inclined to assign a gender to the chair. For me, it at most, it's a sign of absence, but I think it's a tonal arrangement is, I think, what I would come down and describe it as. She painted other versions of the interior of her room about the same time. Here, the windows closed, shutting out the outside world. You can see how that's changed the tonal arrangements of the room, which to me, I mean, that there is a few small touches. The book's gone, it's been replaced by flowers. The outside coat has changed. There's an umbrella. Maybe it's raining outside. So there's various things that you can read in to the parts of the painting. But I think that for me, the two paintings emphasize the fact that what she was interested in is creating this abstract tonal arrangement. Now, this is Girl Reading at a Window, and the collector, John Quinn, I've mentioned before, her only patron, who bought most of her work. Eventually, he owned about 18 of her paintings and about 50 drawings. This one, now he's one of the people that created, if you talk to art historians about what is the most famous art exhibition in New York in the early part of the 20th century, they would all say the Armory Show. The Armory Show was the seminal modern art exhibition in New York in 1913, and he organized it. And there were a lot of famous European and some American artists displayed there. And this work, Girl Reading at the Window, was displayed at that seminal exhibition, the Armory Show, which made her work better known in America. And she could live a simple, independent life, relying solely on the work that he bought. She had one solo exhibition in her lifetime at the new Chenille Gallery in London, and that made her much better known and confirmed her reputation as maybe not at that stage a leading 20th century artist, but important 20th century artist. And with the money she obtained from that exhibition, the solo exhibition, where she sold a number of works, she purchased a bungalow in Meudon, which is in the suburbs of Paris, and built a wall around it. She, by the way, didn't underestimate her own work. She was self-effacing, but confident. She wrote once, after she'd seen an exhibition of Cézanne's work, "These are very good, but I prefer my own." Now, from about mid-1910s onwards, 1914, 15 onwards, her technique changed dramatically. Almost exclusively, she painted female portraits. She painted, as you can see here, much more sparingly. You can see the canvas behind the background. She painted no layers of paint. There's very thin paint. The brush strokes have become visible. She uses no varnish on the finished painting. It's flatter. It's less smooth. Other artists were using similar techniques, but it's certainly not copying a single other artist. She is using this technique, I think, or this set of techniques to create a mood. And if you look at this other work she did, I think it's actually the same model, Study of a Seated Nude Girl. You can see what I mean about working inwards, not consistently as Stanley Spencer did from the top downwards, but in different areas, but basically working from the outside inwards, leaving the details of the face and the body till last, working from the edges. Little preliminary, you can't see any sketching on the canvas background. So she had this strong sense of spatial awareness, as I said. Now, if we look at this this painting on the right, from using raking light, that is, light shone from the side, you can see what I meant about texture. And she created that using a technique. She mixed animal glue and chalk and then applied it very dryly and thinly, and that created these lumps, this rough textured surface. So it creates a texture on the paint, and she painted over that. If we shine a light through the painting, you can see even more clearly how thin the paint is. Particularly notice on the face, it's a lot of the canvas underneath is showing through this animal glue and chalk and the pigment that she puts on top. She uses hardly any paint. This incidentally is one of about 8 almost identical pictures of Girl in a Blue Dress. The model we'll see later, Gwen we don't know who she is. Gwen describes her as just a Murdon neighbour, someone who lived nearby. And she painted, as we'll see, a series called The Convalescent. But let me show you another, just to show you that she painted other paintings, other types of painting. This is an interior. She wrote to her friend Ursula, "I think to do beautiful pictures, we ought to be free from family conventions as ties. I think the family has had its day. We don't go to heaven in families now, but one by one." I think that's a very interesting comment, both on the way she feels about her own family, and also a comment on, if you like, why she never married and had children. She wants to be free from the ties. And she also wrote that fame, whoever became famous for having children, I think she wrote something to that effect. So she was interested in the future view of her, and she thought that family would tie her down and prevent her from achieving what she wanted to achieve. She was domesticated to in the sense that she did keep everything clean and tidy and fresh. And she did write that it was so delicious after a whole day outside. It seems to me that I'm not myself except in my room. In other words, she loved, even though she was on her own, she loved returning to her little room where she felt herself again after a day outside, I assume, mixing with a lot of people. So she was very comfortable being on her own. And I've just found the quote. She told him that she couldn't understand why people wanted to have children. Beautiful monuments were erected to artists who created great works. Nobody ever erected a monument to anyone for having children, is the quote I was looking for. Now, after she left Rodin, as I said, she became a strong Roman Catholic, and she mixed with, she had conversations with a local orphanage run by the Sisters of Charity, and they commissioned her to paint a portrait of the founder of their order, Mère Pusapin. And she worked, because she had lived, that was 200 years before, she worked from a printed prayer card. She worked from an image and produced a number of versions of the founder of the order. But she also painted the nuns. There were two nuns that she used as models, and this is one of them. It took her, by the way, 7 years to complete this painting, and it was the first of a series of paintings. She became very religious. She wrote, "My religion and my art are my entire life." She, as we can see here, I think, from this painting of the nun, it is, as the labels, the title suggests, a generic nun. It's a painting of a nun rather than a particular person. So she's painting an archetypical image, an image about the condition of being a nun rather than the personality of a specific nun. And I think that's sort of typical of her work. This model, we don't know who it was, posed for 6 paintings, several unfinished, but we do know that John Quinn, her patron, who wrote saying, or she wrote to him saying that she was working on this nude and another now lost nude painting, and we know she finished soon after and sent them both to John Quinn, who acknowledged their receipt in 1924, shortly before he died. Back to this model, we saw a girl in a blue dress. It's the same model. This is called The Convalescent, and it's one of 10 very similar paintings of the same girl sitting in a room with a soft, pale light shining on her, using this technique I was describing just now. And we do have a number of sketches as well, which contain this complex numbering system. I should have mentioned that as well as numbering the colors on the sketches that she wants to use in the final painting, she would also include poetic descriptions. And I've got one of the descriptions here just to, I think, illustrate why they were so difficult to decode, even her descriptions. Just listen to this one, this particular color she was describing. April, faded pansies on the sands at night. So I think you can understand why it's quite difficult for us to work out what color she had in mind by April faded pansies on the sands at night. Now, this particular painting she painted for a friend, an American artist called Isabel Bowser, and she'd met her in Paris. She'd in fact, Gwen had modeled for her, and she wrote to Isabel, "I will finish the little painting. It's called The Convalescent. I was going to say," sorry, this is a letter to another friend who she went on to say, "I was going to say to Isabel, it doesn't matter about the title, does it, Isabel? No doubt she was cured by Christian Science. That was a sort of joke." Now, the joke was an affectionate one, because she knew her friend had recently embraced Christian Science, and she knew Christian Science followers refuse conventional medical treatment and believe in spiritual healing. But the joke fell flat. She was saddened by the fact that her friend died of cancer before the painting was finished. And this, in fact, had a deep impact on her. It was the second death within 2 years, because Rodin had died fairly recently as well. And she was deeply affected by these, and another death later, as we shall see. But first, from about 1923, her paintings changed again, and her palette developed this, there was a stronger use of color, and many of the paintings are this mauvish cast, and the contrast has strengthened. The paint is more boldly applied and dragged over the canvas, as you can see from some of these brush strokes here, the paint being dragged over the canvas. She's still painting single women. The outline is rougher. The face is more stylized. The eyes are set high, and the nose is better defined. Some have compared her work, or suggested her work is influenced by Amedeo Modigliani, and she doesn't actually mention him in her letters, but we know she knew his work, and he was actually a friend of her brother, so she probably knew his work quite well. We're getting close to the end now of my talk, and this is one of 2 nearly identical compositions called The Japanese Doll. Now, we don't know exactly when it's painted, but it's thought that the sister of John Quinn, Julia Quinn Anderson, acquired it no earlier than 1928, which is 4 years after her brother had died. So there was a few of her paintings that John Quinn's family continued to buy. And she, the John Quinn's sister, Julia, wrote, I'm sorry the painting of the doll isn't finished. There was a correspondence about Gwen probably taking longer than she expected to paint it. And this is one of her last oil paintings, and her output from this point on, from about 1930, her output dwindled, possibly because of her failing eyesight, but I think more likely because another dear old friend, Rilke, died in 1926. And she then sought religious guidance from a neighbor, Jacques Maritain, who's quite a well-known Catholic philosopher and Catholic theologian. And she sought, really, I mean, one of the things she wanted to know from him is she prayed daily for her friend, but would it be more effective if she prayed nearer the place where her friend had died, was one of her questions. Now, she met, at the same time as she met Jacques Maritain, she met his sister-in-law, Vera Urmansov, and she fell passionately in love with Vera Urmansov and would write every day. We don't think it was physical. Urmansov insisted after a while, it was getting too much writing every day, and Urmansov insisted she write only once a week, and she tended to write on a Monday. Urmansov said that she considered Gwen's passion was incompatible with her, that is Gwen's spiritual welfare. So she regarded their relationship as too passionate. She wanted her to Gwen to cool off. The relationship actually ended in 1930 at Urmansov's insistence. And for the last 8 years of her life, of Gwen's life, she lived as a recluse. Remember, she lived in this house she'd bought with the proceeds of the 1926 exhibition in London, her first solo exhibition. She bought a house and built a wall around the house. So she lived as a recluse. She didn't, by this stage, she wasn't mixing with friends. She was still writing letters. She only had her cats for company. She ate very little. She became weak. She preferred to give the food to her cats. She stopped painting. She did a little drawing. We think she stopped completely. Her last drawing is 1933. She became so weak she could hardly stand. We have no evidence that after that final drawing in March 1933, she did any drawing at all. She did some gardening. We know that she became passionate about gardening. Now, that takes us up to 1939, when she didn't want to live in a war-torn country, and she could see that Germany was about to invade France. She traveled to Dieppe en route to England. She wanted to come back to England, where maybe her life would have been saved by her brother's attention. He did earlier on, he very much cared for and looked after her. But she traveled to Dieppe, fell ill on the way, probably because she was so weak from hunger, and died in Dieppe and was buried as a pauper in an unmarked grave. In fact, I read recently that in the last few years, research has found a document that tells us where her unmarked grave is. So we know where she was buried. Which takes us to the end of my talk. The Augustus and Gwen John are unusual in being brother and sister, and both famous artists. There are a few other brother and sister artists, but I don't think any others where both are so well known. This has led commentators to compare their work, I think dangerously, if you like, to to read too much into their work, because we start to invent ideas about their personality and how that affects their work. Remember, he wrote that she didn't steal through life. Perhaps at the end she changed, but when she was in Paris, she preserved a haughty independence, which people mistook for humility. Augustus, as we'll hear in a few weeks' time, became the most famous British artist of the day. By the time he was 25, he was a society artist. He was compared by critics with Michelangelo, with Gauguin, Matisse. He became legendary for his bohemian lifestyle and for his rumored number of children. I don't think he had 100 illegitimate children, but he certainly had many, many affairs. After he died in 1961, his reputation declined rapidly. And by contrast, her reputation grew and grew and grew. And she is now a celebrated painter of international renown. His reputation is starting to be reclaimed, as we'll find out, I think partly as a result of the Tate exhibition in 2004. Remember, he said, 50 years after my death, I will be remembered as Gwen John's brother. How right he was. She's now regarded as one of the most important painters of the 20th century. He's being largely forgotten, although his reputation is being reevaluated, but he's largely described now as Gwen John's brother. So that brings me to the end of the talk, and look forward to talking about Augustus's work and life in a few weeks' time.